Hello there, Zach King. I'm also an econ student. Shout out to Adam. And so I want to start my presentation off with a bit of a story. In 2007, the band Radiohead released what happens to be one of my favorite albums, In Rainbows, online. But they did this a bit differently than a lot of album rollouts go up. They released it on their website, and instead of charging a specific price for it, you got one download, but you got to choose what you paid. As you can see, it's in pounds because they're a British band, but this was available worldwide. And traditional economic theory would suggest that consumers are utility maximizing. Think of utility as their happiness, and so we think of utility as consumption plus leisure. And so consumers want to maximize their consumption, and so if they can pay a lower amount for a good, they will. So theoretically, we would assume that almost nobody would pay much for the album and would instead take it for free if they can get it for free, so that way they can have more money to spend on their things. What we actually see is 37% of people paid something for the album, even though they didn't have to, which is a lot more than zero. Granted, this is different than the 100% that would be if there was a fixed price, but this still matters, and in some cases, it can be even more profitable. The lead vocalist of the band, Tom York, even says that they made more money from that album than all the other albums that they've ever made up to that point. They got an average payment of about $6, which when you consider that 2/3 of people weren't paying at all, so it's quite a substantial amount of money, especially because they didn't have to pay for licensing, distribution, merchandising, etc. So, why does this work? I want to point out three success factors for the pay what you want model that are detailed by this great paper by Machado and Zena, 2013. First is perceived fairness, second is perceived reciprocity, and third is the elimination of the status quo bias. I'm going to take the liberty of combining these first two and talk about morality and talk about money and having semantic meaning. Money is more than just an impersonal expression of value. We associate, when we spend money, we are asserting a self-image of some kind. Think of Mansa Musa traveling across Eurasia, spreading around so much gold that he's causing hyperinflation in all these small villages to assert some kind of meaning about himself. And this relationship is a two-way street. By making a payment, am I asserting myself as being a fair and just human being to this business? And do I think that my money's going to a good place if I give it to them? Something I want to really point out that you might think of with that is the effects of charity. There's this great study, this experiment done by Nisi et al. In 2010, where they allowed people to pay what they wanted for the photo you get after riding an amusement park ride. And so, just in the normal model, they've had an average payment of about 92 cents. But when asserting that 50% of the proceeds for the purchase of the photo were going to charity, it went up to an average of $5.33. And if you notice, even after giving half of those proceeds to charity, the revenue for the amusement park itself is considerably higher with having that caveat, because people are more willing to pay for others than they are themselves. Now I want to talk about status quo bias I mentioned earlier. I pictured a candy store here. You might notice all of these you may not be able to see it super well, but all of these have price tags on them. This is how we're used to buying things. Things have a set price, and we pay that set price. And so consumers have a natural distrust for the pay what you want model because there are defaults for a reason. How good could this good or service be if you're willing to give it to me for free or way less than I would expect? And so how we alleviate a lot of this is that it's a psychological phenomenon called anchoring, where people get anchored to the first number they see. And so if you offer a default price suggestion, I have a couple of examples here, such as the average consumer paid for this, or having a list of options and having one pre-checked. There's three important factors at play here that determine how people respond to these anchors and these default price suggestions. First is that more consumers will pay a lower default because there's a lower area of entry. They perceive it as more fair. If you offer a range, people get to assert themselves as being fairer than average, or more just than average, or more reciprocal than average by paying on the upper end of a range. It's called the warm glow effect. And if you set too high of a default, consumers can perceive it as coercive and actually want to pay you less. And maybe you've made this connection to pay what you want in tipping, but within the past few years, there's been a lot of discourse about tipping because people feel that they've set these anchors higher and higher, these pre-check go higher and higher. This is a great survey done by this corporation called Pop Menu that does collects a lot of data from a lot of restaurants, and a lot of these people over the past couple of years are moving from tipping these higher percentages to less than 10%, and in rare cases not tipping at all. One more thing I want to mention is that pay what you want goods or services act as a threshold public good, where they're not supplied at all until they make a certain amount, and then they can be supplied. This is different than how we traditionally consider supply, and that the more people are willing to pay for it, the more of a good can be supplied. In this case, it's like a binary, either you do or you don't. A good example of this is Wikipedia. Anytime you go on Wikipedia, you're very likely to get a big pop-up like this because they are a nonprofit. Your usage of it does not impact anybody else's usage of it. And yet, they make enough money from this to have been operating since 2001. Now that I've gone over all of that, I want to discuss the ideal market conditions for a pay-what-you-want model to be most effective. First is having low marginal or variable costs. Think digital goods. The example with having the album earlier, that file, the MP3 file, is uploaded to a server. It doesn't really cost that much money to give somebody access to that. Second is something with strong loyalty effects. People have high attachment. If there's a brand has high attachment to some sort of brand image, or something that people really attach to emotionally, such as art, there will be a greater perception of reciprocity that somebody is getting from that and wanting to give back. There is a little bit of research showing that it could be a short-term way of like being a marketing stunt to establish yourself, establish a kind of brand image, although this is less successful than just already having a strong brand image to begin. Third is goods and services that are already prone to the free rider problem, already prone to people who consume the good or the service without paying anything for it. Goods that are non-rival, such as public goods or club goods. To cover some successes of the pay-what-you-want model, the One World Cafe in Salt Lake City has been operating since 2003 and has been self-sustainable in 2003, in part because they have a very high amount of community attachment. A lot of their labor is done through volunteers who go unpaid because it's volunteer work, and so that reduces costs of production. Another example is the online apparel company Everlane, having a mission statement for ethical transparency and having a promotional where they allowed consumers to pay at 3 price points, covering production costs, covering production and some operational costs, and covering growth of the company. And this was successful because it created a feedback loop. It created increased reciprocal effects. So failures would be such as Amtrak had an experiment for a while, but people didn't really care about Amtrak as a brand. The train to them was the train. They saw it more as it just being an existing discount that they were getting away with. And even though it was, in theory, it's a good idea to fill up those extra slots that were already, because the train's gonna go either way no matter how many seats are filled because it's on the schedule. The revenue the reduced revenue from implementing this model entirely couldn't cover the high fixed costs of manufacturing these trains and the railways and the maintenance. Another example is PWC tax services offered to pay what you want for tax services, and because consumers don't understand what it costs to file taxes or have that kind of knowledge, they didn't know what kind of price to assign because there was no proper anchoring, and they were worried that if they paid a lower price that they would get a lower service. Additionally, because they were offering, even though they purported themselves as a high value brand, as a premium service, offering their services for potentially a super low cost undermined that image. I don't think I have a ton of time for final thoughts. I guess I have 1 minute. So there is a lot of, there is a research gap involved here because this is a relatively new model. And so there's some things I can't say as conclusively as I would have desired to. Additionally, I also had to cut my presentation probably in half for what I would have wanted to give because I only have 12 minutes. So if there's anything that you want clarification on, specifically anchoring, I can talk about anchoring all day. That'll be it. Otherwise, I'll leave the discussion to you. I have to show all my references. 1, 2, 3. Any thoughts? Yes.
Why do you think that bands like Radiohead or the Bakery, like, are they trying to increase profits by doing this, or is it more about like morality? Like, why are people choosing this option?
I think that there is potential. There is potential for it to be profit maximizing relative to a fixed price model, but I think most of its implementations, because it's so morality reliant, are to kind of like reinforce a brand image, reinforce a sense of community. I would say in a lot of cases, in a lot of successful cases, it leans more towards that. There is something to be said about how Pay What You Want allows for Pareto improving price discrimination, that producers could capture more consumer surplus when it is profitable. But anything else? I'll just do it.
I resonate with having to cut your presentation in half. And I do have sources. But I'm curious, have you looked into how this Pay What You Want model would operate during periods of economic downturn, people's buying power?
I have not at all. That's actually a really good point. I have not looked into that one bit. Dr. Dannenberg, did you have a question?
Do you see options for like somebody using Kickstarter to do Pay What You Want?
Yeah, there is some research that shows that offering tiered options, like having a base Pay What You Want, but then offering additional tiers with additional perks, is actually a really useful way of anchoring people, of getting people to pay more, of increasing willingness to pay by giving them extra incentives. Thank you. Is that what we got?
I think we have time for one more, unless no one has any more questions.
I'll let them all speechless.
Okay.